In the quiet archives of American medicine, buried deep within forgotten ledgers and brittle, yellowed correspondence, there lies a story that was never meant to be told. It is not a case of disease or a triumph of science. It is the story of a boy who did not seek a cure. He was the cure's opposite. He was a question that walked on 2 feet, a quiet horror that wore a child's face and haunted not a house, but an entire profession. In the year 1886, long before the age of digital records and instant communication, physicians of the American Midwest began to write about a boy named Jonathan, and they would never be the same again. If the quiet dread of history's forgotten corridors is where you feel most at home, and you have only just found this archive, consider subscribing to ensure you do not miss the records we are yet to unseal. The year was 1886. In the vast, open heartland of the American Midwest, where towns were little more than hopeful clusters of wood and brick against an endless sky, the county hospital stood as a bastion of reason. It was a place of sterile order, governed by the precise scratching of pen on paper. Dr. Alistair Finch, a man of 50 years with a reputation for meticulous record-keeping, was the first to encounter the anomaly. His office, like so many others of its time, was a small world illuminated by the soft yellow glow of a gas lamp. The air held a permanent, layered scent, a mixture of carbolic acid used for cleaning, the dry, dusty perfume of medical texts, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh ink. His ledger was his world, a thick, leather-bound volume where every patient was an entry, a puzzle to be solved and neatly catalogued. Each line was a testament to the empirical, the knowable. Sickness had a name. Treatment had a process. Life and death were recorded with the same dispassionate clarity. On a Tuesday in early October, a day marked by the relentless drumming of a cold autumn rain against the window panes, that clarity was fractured. A boy appeared at the clinic door. He was not brought by a worried mother or a stern father. He was not accompanied by a parish priest or a concerned neighbor. He stood alone, a small, still figure against the gray afternoon. The hospital clerks, men accustomed to the frantic energy of the sick and injured, noted his arrival with a flicker of confusion. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years of age, with a complexion so pale it seemed to absorb the weak light of the hallway. His hair was the color of dry straw, and his eyes, a washed-out shade of blue, were unnervingly calm. He was dressed in simple, well-mended clothes that bore no distinguishing marks, no hint of his origin or station. He did not cry. He did not fidget. He simply waited, his hands folded neatly in front of him, until he was noticed. When asked his name, he replied with a voice that was soft but clear. He said his name was Jonathan. He was shown into the office of Dr. Finch. The doctor, looking up from his notes, saw a child who seemed entirely out of place, not because he was a child in a place of suffering, but because he bore no signs of it. His posture was perfect. His breathing was even. There was no flush of fever on his cheeks, no tremor in his small hands. Dr. Finch asked the boy what was wrong, what ailment had brought him here. Jonathan's response was the first stone cast into the placid waters of the doctor's understanding. He said that nothing was wrong. He said he merely wished to be examined. The request was polite, almost formal, yet it carried an undercurrent of strange insistence that prickled the hairs on the doctor's neck. There was a detachment in the boy's tone, a cool curiosity as if he were a visitor to a museum, not a patient in a clinic. Dr. Finch, a man who believed in process, began the examination. He was a professional. A boy was a boy. An examination was an examination. He listened to the boy's chest with his stethoscope, the cold metal disc pressing against the pale skin. He expected to hear the steady, rhythmic beat of a young heart, the gentle whisper of air filling and leaving the lungs. What he heard was normal, entirely, frustratingly normal. The boy's heart beat with a steady, metronomic rhythm. His lungs were clear. The doctor checked his temperature. It was normal. He looked into the boy's eyes with a small light, checking the response of his pupils. They contracted and expanded as they should. He felt the glands in the boy's neck. There was no swelling. Throughout the entire process, Jonathan remained perfectly still, his calm, blue eyes fixed on the doctor's face. It was not the fearful stillness of a child enduring an unpleasant experience. It was the patient stillness of an observer, as if he were the one conducting the study. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the scratching of the doctor's pen as he made his notes. But what was there to write? Patient presents with no symptoms. Patient requests examination for no stated reason. Patient appears in perfect health. It was a phantom entry in his otherwise concrete ledger. The most unsettling part of the encounter was the complete lack of context. When Dr. Finch asked Jonathan where his parents were, the boy simply stated that he did not have any. He did not say this with sadness or self-pity. He said it as one might state a simple, unchangeable fact, like the color of the sky. When asked where he lived, Jonathan gave no answer, his gaze remaining placid and unwavering. The hospital clerks made their own inquiries. They checked the town registry. They spoke to the constable. They sent a runner to the local parish. No one had ever seen the boy before. There was no record of a Jonathan matching his description in any census, no note of him in any schoolhouse or church. He had, it seemed, simply materialized out of the autumn rain, a boy with no past and no connections. He was a loose page from a book no one had ever read. After the examination, for which no payment was offered or requested, the boy simply stood, gave a slight, formal nod to Dr. Finch, and walked out of the clinic. He vanished back into the gray, wet afternoon as quietly as he had arrived. Dr. Finch tried to dismiss the incident. He was a man of science, of logic. Children were prone to odd fancies. Perhaps the boy was a runaway from a neighboring county, a child caught in some delusion. He completed his entry in the ledger, the black ink stark against the white page. Jonathan. Age approximately 9. No discernible illness. No guardian present. Origin unknown. He closed the book, the heavy leather cover thudding with a sound of finality. But it was not the end. It was the beginning. 2 weeks later, 50 miles to the west in the town of New Providence, Dr. Samuel Reed, a younger physician known for his skeptical nature, recorded a nearly identical encounter. A pale boy named Jonathan, unaccompanied, who requested an examination despite having no symptoms. Dr. Reed, much like his colleague, found nothing wrong. He too noted the boy's unsettling composure, his detached curiosity, his polite but persistent nature. He too was struck by the absence of any parent or guardian. The boy's origin was a complete mystery, and so it began to spread. A quiet epidemic, not of sickness, but of presence. From one county hospital to the next, the story was the same. A lone boy, always named Jonathan, always pale and calm, arriving without explanation and requesting an examination. Each physician he visited was a man of medicine, trained to see the human body as a machine that could be understood, its ailments diagnosed and treated. They were men who dealt in facts, in evidence, in the tangible world of flesh and bone. But this boy, this Jonathan, was something else. He was not a patient in the traditional sense. He was an event. His visits were recorded in the precise, spidery script of 19th century medical ledgers, entries that sat awkwardly among the fevers, the fractures, and the consumptions. The smell of ink and antiseptic that filled these lamplit offices, A smell that usually signified order and control now seemed to mingle with something else, an unspoken and unwritten question. The quiet, staring boy was a stark contrast to this world of recorded certainty. The physicians who saw him found themselves unnerved in a way they could not articulate. It was not fear in the conventional sense. The boy was not threatening. He was polite, quiet, and cooperative. Yet his presence lingered long after he was gone. It was in the way he watched them, his gaze steady and ancient, as if he knew the contents of their minds. It was in the perfect, unnatural stillness he maintained during their examinations. Doctors were accustomed to the human body's imperfections, its twitches, its tremors, its constant, subtle movements. Jonathan was as still as a figure in a photograph. He seemed less a living, breathing child and more a perfect, unnerving representation of one. They would find themselves thinking of him late at night, the image of his pale face and calm eyes rising unbidden in their minds. They wondered about the void that surrounded him. Where did he go after he left their clinics? Where did he sleep? What did he eat? Who had mended the cuffs of his simple coat? These were human questions, but Jonathan seemed to exist outside the realm of human needs. The core of their unease was a professional one. Their purpose was to find what was wrong, to name the illness, to provide the cure. Jonathan defied this purpose. In him, there was nothing to fix. He presented them with a perfect surface, and in doing so, he held up a mirror to the limits of their own knowledge. He was a living embodiment of the unknown, a silent challenge to their science. He was not a patient to be healed. He was a riddle to be solved, and they had no tools for such a task. Their medical training had prepared them for the complexities of the body, but not for the complexities of a presence that had no right to exist. Why did he appear to them, and only them? Why did he seek the detached, clinical gaze of a physician? The question hung in the air of their offices, as silent and persistent as the boy himself. This was only the beginning of the phenomenon. In these early days, each encounter was an isolated incident, a local curiosity filed away in a county ledger. The doctors who met Jonathan did not know that their colleagues, miles away, were writing down the exact same story, recording the same pale face, the same calm eyes, the same unsettling request. They did not yet know that they were not alone in their quiet disturbance. They were individual threads in a tapestry they could not yet see. The story of Jonathan was contained within the stiff, leather-bound books, a secret kept in ink and paper. But secrets, like illnesses, have a way of spreading. The case of the boy who haunted physicians was just beginning to cross county lines, moving silently and invisibly, not by road or by rail, but from one doctor's pen to another, an unexplainable presence traveling faster than any horse could carry him. The whispers were about to begin. The encounters remained isolated for a time, confined to the pages of individual ledgers like islands of ink in a sea of medical certainty. Each physician who met the boy believed his experience to be unique, a singular curiosity in a long career of explainable ailments. Dr. Finch in his county seat, Dr. Reed in the bustling river town of New Providence, and a dozen others scattered across the flat, open plains of the Midwest. Each recorded the visit of the pale boy named Jonathan. They wrote down his placid demeanor, his polite and unsettling request for an examination, and the utter lack of any discernible illness. They noted his solitude, the absence of any guardian or family to account for him, and then they turned the page. They moved on to the next patient, the next case of influenza or broken bone, pushing the memory of the strange boy into the quiet recesses of their minds. But the ink was dry, the record was made, and in the dusty archives of their clinics, a pattern was waiting to be seen. The ledgers themselves, with their heavy, leather-bound covers and pages filled with methodical script, held the secret. The paper was cheap, often absorbing the ink in a way that made the letters bleed slightly at the edges, the words spreading like dark, delicate veins. It was as if the books were alive, carrying a contagion of information that was slowly, silently, preparing to spread. The connection began not with a frantic discovery, but with the mundane rhythm of professional correspondence. In the late 19th century, physicians relied heavily on letters to consult with colleagues, to discuss difficult cases, and to maintain the bonds of their small, scattered fraternity. In the winter of 1886, Dr. Alistair Finch found himself perplexed by a persistent outbreak of diphtheria. He wrote a letter to his old acquaintance, Dr. Samuel Reed, whose town lay 100 miles to the west, seeking his opinion on a new treatment. The letter was long, filled with clinical details and professional concerns. At the very end, almost as an afterthought, Dr. Finch added a short paragraph about a peculiar incident from the autumn. He described a boy named Jonathan, a child who had appeared without cause and vanished without a trace. He wrote that the encounter had left him with a strange sense of unease he could not quite shake. He asked if Dr. Reed had ever experienced such a thing. The letter traveled for 3 days by train and carriage, a simple piece of paper carrying a question that would unravel the certainties of many. Dr. Reed received the letter on a cold, wind-swept morning. He read through the clinical details of the diphtheria outbreak with professional interest, but it was the final paragraph that made him stop. The description of the boy was not just familiar, it was exact. The pale complexion, the calm blue eyes, the quiet formality, the name Jonathan. It was the same boy who had walked into his own clinic just weeks before. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. A single, isolated incident was a curiosity. 2 identical incidents, separated by 100 miles, was something else entirely. It was a pattern. Dr. Reed wrote back to Dr. Finch immediately. His letter confirmed the encounter in every detail. He then took it upon himself to write to 2 other physicians he knew in neighboring states, men of science and sound judgment. He posed the same question Dr. Finch had asked him. He described the boy, and he asked if they had ever seen him. The replies, when they came, were slow but certain. One doctor from a small town in Illinois confirmed the visit. Another, from the edge of the Wisconsin territories, sent back a letter that trembled with a barely concealed agitation. He too had seen the boy. A network of letters began to crisscross the Midwest. A quiet, urgent correspondence between men of medicine. They compared their notes, their ledger entries transcribed word for word. The descriptions of Jonathan were so consistent it was as if he had been perfectly replicated, a printed image appearing in different places. The same straw-colored hair, the same mended, featureless clothing, the same unnatural stillness. Each doctor had independently noted his polite but detached manner of speaking. Each had been struck by the unnerving wisdom in his young eyes. The evidence accumulated, page by page, letter by letter. This was not a case of a wandering orphan. This was something far stranger. The physicians, men trained to diagnose illness in others, found themselves diagnosing a phenomenon, a shared experience that defied logical explanation. They were cartographers mapping an impossibility. The true horror of the situation became clear when they began to compare the dates recorded in their ledgers. The overlaps were not just improbable, they were a violation of the known laws of space and time. On the morning of November 3rd, 1886, Dr. Finch had examined Jonathan in his clinic. His ledger entry was precise, noting the time as just after 10 o'clock. On that very same day, Dr. Reed's ledger showed an entry for Jonathan at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The two towns were separated by more than 120 miles of rough roads and uncertain railway lines. For the boy to have traveled from one to the other in that time was a physical impossibility. There was no train schedule, no horse fast enough that could account for it. The doctors at first sought rational explanations. Perhaps there were two boys, twins, separated and engaged in some elaborate prank, but the idea withered under scrutiny. The descriptions were too identical, down to a small, faded scar above the left eyebrow that 3 separate physicians had noted. Perhaps, some suggested, it was a case of shared delusion, a folie à deux spread across an entire profession, but these were sober, rational men. Their notes were clinical, their observations detached. They had not imagined him, they had examined him. The truth, as it slowly dawned on them, was far more terrifying. The boy named Jonathan was not bound by the same rules of existence as everyone else. One physician, a man named Dr. Elias Thorne, who practiced in a remote settlement and was known more for his philosophical inclinations than his medical innovations, had an encounter that added another layer to the mystery. When Jonathan appeared in his small, wood-paneled office, Dr. Thorne did something the others had not. After the fruitless examination, he sat with the boy and tried to speak with him not as a patient, but as a person. He asked the boy what he wanted, why he came to see men like him. Jonathan, as usual, did not answer the questions directly. He simply sat there, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze unwavering. After a long, heavy silence, the boy spoke. It was not an answer, but a question of his own. He asked Dr. Thorne if he would still remember him when the others forgot. The question struck the doctor with the force of a physical blow. It was not the question of a child. It was the question of a being who understood the nature of memory, of legacy, of being recorded. It implied that Jonathan knew he was an entry in a book, a line of ink on a page. It suggested that his existence was somehow tied to their remembrance of him. Dr. Thorne wrote about this in a letter to his colleagues. The boy was not a passive anomaly. He seemed to be engaged in a purpose, an act of ensuring he was written down, that he was witnessed by the very men whose job it was to observe and record the frailties of human life. Fueled by this new, chilling perspective, the network of physicians undertook a more thorough and desperate search for Jonathan's origins. They pooled their resources. They wrote to government agencies, to census bureaus in every state from Pennsylvania to the Dakotas. They contacted orphanages, religious orders, and law enforcement officials across the country. They searched for any record of a missing boy, any family name that might be connected to him, any hint of where he might have come from. The result was a profound and unnerving silence. The vast bureaucratic machinery of the nation turned up nothing. It was as if Jonathan had never been born. There was no birth certificate, no baptismal record, no school enrollment. He did not exist in any official capacity. The only place he was real, the only proof of his existence, was in the private ledgers of the physicians he had visited. He was a ghost in the machine of record-keeping, a being made of ink and memory. The dread among the doctors began to change. It was no longer a professional curiosity. It was becoming a personal burden. They had uncovered a pattern that made no sense, a shared secret that isolated them from the rest of the world. Who could they tell? Who would believe them? They were men of science, and what they had discovered belonged to the realm of ghost stories told around a winter fire. The phenomenon was no longer something they were simply observing. It felt as if it was observing them back, and for one of them, the barrier between the clinic and the outside world was about to break. Dr. Samuel Reed, the skeptic, the man who had first confirmed the pattern, began to feel a new kind of fear. He had become obsessed with the case, spending his nights poring over the letters from his colleagues, trying to find a rational thread in the impossible tapestry. One evening, as he walked home from his clinic, the streets dark and slick with rain, he saw him. Across the town square, standing under the flickering gaslight of a street lamp, was a small, still figure. It was the boy. He was not looking for a clinic. He was not seeking an examination. He was just standing there, watching. Dr. Reed's heart hammered in his chest. Jonathan was no longer waiting for an invitation. He had been summoned by the doctor's own consuming thoughts, a haunting that had stepped out of the ledger and into his life. The official correspondence, the letters of professional inquiry, began to dwindle. In their place, something far more personal and far more terrifying started to circulate among the small, frightened circle of physicians. These new letters were not written in the clear, confident script of men of science. They were penned late at night, in the solitary quiet of private studies, the words often hurried and blotched, as if the writer feared being observed. They were confessions, testimonials of a creeping dread that had breached the sterile walls of the clinic and followed these men home. The subject was always the same, Jonathan. But he was no longer just a clinical anomaly. He was a presence in their lives, a silent interlocutor who seemed to know their deepest, most private fears. The ledger entries had been a record of his body. These letters were a record of his effect on their souls. The tone was no longer one of detached curiosity. It had become paranoid, confessional, the sound of professional composure cracking under an unbearable, unseen weight. Dr. Horatio Ellsworth was the first to write of a true violation. He was a physician in a quiet Ohio town, a man who had built his life on routine and predictability. Dr. Ellsworth was a widower of some 10 years, a man who found comfort in the small, repeating rituals of his solitary life, the winding of the grandfather clock in the hall every Sunday, the precise way he arranged his medical journals, the single glass of sherry he took before bed. His home was his sanctuary, a fortress of quiet order against the chaos of sickness and death he faced each day. He had examined Jonathan 2 months prior, an experience that had left him with the same lingering unease as his colleagues. He had recorded it, filed it away, and tried to forget. But the boy had not forgotten him. In a letter to Dr. Reed, his hand shaking so badly that the ink bled into the paper, he described what had happened on the night of December the 5th. He wrote that he had woken suddenly, in the dead of night. There had been no sound, no sudden noise to startle him from his sleep. It was a change in the atmosphere of the room, a sudden oppressive stillness that felt heavier than the winter cold. The air, he wrote, felt thick, as if all the sound had been absorbed out of it. His heart began to pound in his chest, a frantic, trapped bird. He lay frozen in his bed, his eyes wide in the darkness, listening. He heard only the familiar groan of the old house settling, a sound that had always brought him comfort but now seemed menacing. Slowly, he forced himself to turn his head toward the window, where the pale, thin light of a crescent moon filtered through the glass, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. And that is when he saw him. Standing at the foot of his bed, bathed in the sickly moonlight, was Jonathan. He was perfectly still, a small, dark silhouette against the window. He was not a dream. He was not a phantom. He was solid, real, a physical presence in the most private of spaces. Dr. Ellsworth wrote that his first instinct, the instinct of a physician, was to diagnose. He thought perhaps he was in the grip of a fever, a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But the cold dread that washed over him was no symptom of illness. It was the primal animal fear of a predator found in the lair. The boy said nothing. He did not move. He simply stood there and watched, his face a pale oval in the gloom, his eyes seeming to reflect the meager light with an intensity that was not human. Dr. Ellsworth could not scream. The sound was trapped in his throat, a knot of pure terror. He felt as if the boy's silent gaze was pinning him to the bed, examining him far more deeply than he had ever examined the boy. He saw in the child's eyes not malice, but a cold, ancient curiosity, the look of a naturalist observing a specimen. The doctor lay there for what felt like an eternity, his body rigid, his mind screaming, until he finally succumbed to the darkness of a forced, dreamless sleep. When he awoke in the gray light of morning, the boy was gone. There was no sign of his presence, no footprint on the rug, no disturbance in the room. There was only the memory, burned into his mind, and the unshakable feeling that his home was no longer his own. The letters from other physicians told of different but equally unsettling violations. A surgeon from Louisville, a man renowned for the precision of his hands and the quality of his German steel instruments, wrote a panicked account of what happened after Jonathan's visit to his practice. The surgeon, a Dr. Abram Calloway, took immense pride in his tools. He cleaned and polished them himself after every procedure, their silver gleam a symbol of his craft and his commitment to modern medicine. Jonathan had come to him with the usual polite request for an examination. Dr. Calloway, a man of brisk efficiency, had performed it quickly and dismissed the boy as a peculiar but harmless eccentric. The next morning, when he unlocked the polished oak case where he kept his instruments, he found them ruined. Every scalpel, every forceps, every surgical needle was covered in a strange, creeping layer of rust. It was not the slow, orange bloom of normal oxidation. It was a dark, reddish-black corrosion that seemed to have eaten into the very heart of the metal, leaving the edges pitted and dull. The steel, he wrote, felt brittle to the touch, as if some vital essence had been drained from it. He was certain Jonathan had not touched the instruments. The boy had sat perfectly still on the examination table, yet the surgeon could not escape the conviction that the boy's mere presence in the room had caused this unnatural decay. It was an omen, a sign that the boy's influence was not just psychological, but physical. He was a source of some quiet, invisible corrosion that targeted the very tools of their trade. From a small, isolated town in the northern woods came another story, this one from a country physician named Dr. Michael O'Connell. He was a practical, no-nonsense man, accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. His letter was short, the words stark and chilling. He wrote that he had examined Jonathan late one afternoon, as the winter sun was setting. The gas lamp in his small office cast long, dancing shadows on the wall. As the boy was preparing to leave, Dr. O'Connell happened to glance at the shadows. His own was a normal, if elongated, silhouette, but the boy's shadow was wrong. It was a thing of impossible dimensions. It stretched far longer than his own, a long, thin stain of darkness that reached all the way up the wall and onto the ceiling. It was darker than the other shadows in the room, a patch of absolute blackness. And it did not seem to be connected to the boy in the right way. It seemed to have a life of its own, to twitch and lengthen independently of the child's small movements. The doctor wrote that he had felt a cold sweat break out on his brow as he stared at it. He felt as if he were not looking at a shadow, but at the true shape of the thing that stood before him. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, a brief, terrifying look at the unnatural reality that wore the mask of a pale, quiet boy. As these private testimonies were shared, a disturbing new pattern emerged. The physicians realized that Jonathan never spoke of illness. He never complained of a cough, a fever, or a pain. His sole focus was on them. The letters began to recount snippets of his reported speech, and they were all unnervingly personal. He had asked Dr. Finch, a man who privately feared the encroaching forgetfulness of old age, if he ever worried that he would one day be unable to remember the names of all the people he had saved. He had asked Dr. Reed, who was known for his fierce professional ambition, if he believed his work would still be spoken of in 100 years. To Dr. Ellsworth, just before he had left his office that first day, he had quietly said that a house must be a lonely place when you are the only one who walks its halls at night. He seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of their hidden anxieties, the secret fears that lay dormant beneath their professional exteriors. He was not a patient seeking a diagnosis. He was a confessor, a silent mirror who reflected their own vulnerabilities back at them. The question that had haunted them from the beginning, "What does Jonathan want?" now had a chilling, partial answer. He did not want treatment. He wanted access. He wanted to see them, to be near them, to study them. He was a collector of their fears. The profession, which had once been a source of strength and shared knowledge, now became a fragile network of shared terror. These men, who had once written to each other with confidence and clarity, now wrote as if they were conspirators, sharing a truth so monstrous that it could not be spoken aloud. The creak of a floorboard in a midnight home, a sudden knock on a door that no one else heard, the feeling of being watched from a darkened window, all these things became attributed to him. He was no longer just an anomaly in their ledgers. He had become a ghost in their lives, a haunting that was tailored to each of them. The dread was no longer abstract. It was personal. And it was this intensely personal fear that finally drove one physician to a desperate conclusion. The boy was not a medical case, but he was a physical being, and if he was physical, he could be understood. A standard examination was not enough. To understand the unnatural, one must employ unnatural methods. One doctor, a man more daring and perhaps more reckless than the rest, decided he would not just observe Jonathan. He would dissect the mystery, piece by piece, even if it meant tearing apart his own understanding of the world. He would conduct an examination that went far beyond the ordinary scope, an investigation into the very fabric of the boy's impossible existence. Dr. Marcus Hardin was a man apart from his colleagues. While most physicians of his era were content with the established boundaries of medical science, Dr. Hardin was a relentless explorer of its frontiers. He practiced in a large, modern clinic in a bustling city, a place of gleaming instruments and new, experimental treatments. He was a man driven by an insatiable, almost obsessive need to know. He was not afraid of the unknown. He saw it as a territory to be conquered, a darkness to be illuminated by the bright, unwavering lamp of scientific inquiry. When the whispered stories and frightened letters about Jonathan reached him, he did not feel the same creeping dread as the others. He felt a surge of professional curiosity that bordered on exhilaration. He saw in the boy not a supernatural terror, but the ultimate medical puzzle. He did not hope to avoid Jonathan. He actively wished for his visit. He prepared for it, laying out his instruments not for healing, but for a deep, forbidden kind of analysis. In the early spring of 1887, his wish was granted. Jonathan walked into his clinic, and Dr. Hardin was ready. The examination room was Dr. Hardin's laboratory. It was a sterile, white-tiled chamber, brightly lit by several hissing gas lamps that cast a stark, shadowless glare on everything. This was a place designed to leave no room for ambiguity, no corner for secrets to hide in. He had dismissed his assistants. He wanted no other witnesses to what he was about to do. He and the boy were alone, sealed in a world of clinical white and gleaming metal. Jonathan appeared exactly as the letters had described. The pale face, the calm eyes, the unnerving stillness. He submitted to the examination with his usual placid cooperation, but this was to be no ordinary examination. Dr. Hardin began with the basics, but his observations were far more intense, his instruments more precise. He placed his stethoscope on the boy's chest, the vulcanized rubber cold against the impossibly pale skin. He listened. The heartbeat was there, a steady, rhythmic thump, but it was wrong. It was too slow, far too slow for a child of that age. It was the lethargic, measured beat of a man in his final, dying hours, a heart conserving its last few moments of energy. And between each beat, there was a profound and absolute silence, a stillness that felt deeper than a mere pause. It was as if, for a fraction of a second, the heart simply ceased to be. He then asked the boy to breathe. Jonathan inhaled and exhaled as requested. Dr. Hardin saw the visible rise and fall of the boy's chest, the slight flare of his nostrils. He saw the faint, misty cloud of his breath in the cool air of the room, but when he placed the stethoscope to the boy's back, he heard nothing. There was no gentle rush of air, no sound of lungs expanding and contracting. There was only a dead, hollow silence, the sound of an empty vessel. The breath was visible, but it was audibly non-existent. It was a phantom process, a perfect imitation of a biological function with none of the underlying mechanics. Dr. Hardin felt a tremor in his hand, a flicker of something that was not scientific curiosity, but primal fear. He suppressed it. He was a man of reason. He made a note in the ledger he had open on his desk. Heartbeat irregular and dangerously slow. Lungs audibly silent despite visible respiration. The words looked like madness on the page. Next, he turned his attention to the boy's eyes. He brought a lamp closer, the flame flickering and casting dancing reflections in the boy's wide blue pupils. He expected to see the normal reaction to light. Instead, what he saw made the breath catch in his throat. The boy's pupils did not contract in a uniform way. They seemed to dilate and constrict with a strange, liquid motion, like drops of ink swirling in water, and the reflections in their surface were not of the room he was in. Dr. Hardin leaned closer, his own face just inches from the child's. He saw, reflected in those small blue orbs, not the white tiles and gas lamps of his clinic, but other places. He saw a dusty, sun-drenched road stretching to an empty horizon. He saw a dark, churning ocean beneath a stormy sky. He saw a room filled with books, their leather spines crumbling to dust. These images flickered and changed with dizzying speed, a torrent of alien landscapes and forgotten rooms pouring from the boy's gaze. It was as if his eyes were not windows to a soul, but portals to 1,000 other places, 1,000 other times. Dr. Hardin recoiled, stumbling back from the boy, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sterile, rational world of his clinic seemed to be dissolving around him. He fought for control. He was a scientist. He needed data. He needed tangible, physical evidence. He reached out and placed his hand on the boy's forearm. The sensation that met his fingers was a paradox, a physical impossibility that sent a shockwave of revulsion through him. The boy's skin was, at once, burning with a dry, feverish heat, and yet, beneath that surface layer, it was as cold as a block of ice. It was not the simple cold of poor circulation. It was a deep, penetrating coldness, the absolute zero of a thing that had never known the warmth of life. The contradiction was so profound, so utterly wrong, that Dr. Hardin snatched his hand back as if he had been burned. He looked at his own fingers, half expecting to see them blistered and frostbitten at the same time. Jonathan did not react. His expression remained one of serene, untroubled calm. He simply watched the doctor's mounting panic with a look of detached, clinical interest. It was a complete reversal of their roles. The boy was the observer. The doctor was the specimen, his certainties being flayed open one by one. It was then that Dr. Hardin, in a final, desperate act of scientific defiance, decided to take a sample. He turned to his instrument tray and picked up a small, sterile lancet. He would draw a single drop of blood, Blood was the river of life, the very essence of biological reality. It would tell him everything. It would have a type. It would have cells. It would be real. He turned back to the boy, the lancet held firmly in his hand. He said he needed to prick his finger. For the first time, the boy's expression changed. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was a look of profound, almost sorrowful disappointment. The boy simply shook his head, a small, slow gesture. And then he spoke. He said that the doctor would not like what he found. The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, a final, quiet warning. But Dr. Hardin was beyond listening. He lunged forward, grabbing the boy's small hand. The rest was a blur of disconnected, nightmarish images. He remembered the feeling of the lancet touching the boy's skin, the resistance that was not like flesh but like cold, hard rubber. He remembered a sudden, blinding flash of light that seemed to erupt from the point of contact. He remembered the smell of ozone, sharp and electric, filling the room, and then darkness. Dr. Hardin collapsed. He did not faint. He was plunged into a state of absolute non-existence, a black void where time and thought ceased. When he awoke, he was on the cold tiled floor of his clinic. The room was empty. The boy was gone. A deep, throbbing pain radiated from his head, and the air was still thick with the strange electric smell. He staggered to his feet, his body shaking uncontrollably. He looked at his desk. His ledger was still open, and it was covered in blood. The pages were splashed with dark, crimson spatters, and scrawled across his own neat clinical notes was a frantic, terrifying script. It was his own handwriting, but it was wild and jagged, completely unrecognizable. The words were a stream of consciousness, a torrent of mad, disjointed phrases. Body is a vessel. Skin is a container. Cold is the space between stars. Eyes hold forgotten rooms. He wrote that the blood was not blood. He described it as a thick, black fluid, like ink, that moved as if it were alive. He wrote that it had no cells, no life, but that it held memories, that he could feel them pouring into him as he touched it. The final, spidery sentence was written at the bottom of the page, the ink smudged and blotted as if his hand had failed him. It is not alive. It is a record. He stared at the pages, his mind reeling. He had no memory of writing any of it. He had no memory of the blood. He looked at his hands. They were clean. There was no blood on the floor, no sign of the black fluid he had apparently described. There was only the ledger, a testament to an event his mind refused to recall. The forbidden examination had not provided answers. It had shattered the very concept of questions. The boy was not alive. He was not dead. He was something else. Something for which the precise language of medicine, the entire lexicon of human understanding, had no name. Dr. Hardin, the man who had sought to conquer the unknown, had been utterly and completely broken by it. He closed the blood-stained ledger, and the sound echoed in the silent room like a tomb being sealed. The news of his collapse and the strange, incoherent notes he had left behind began to spread. The quiet dread among the physicians curdled into active, palpable fear. They now understood. They were not dealing with a curiosity. They were dealing with a contagion of the impossible. And they began to fear, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, the moment that Jonathan would next appear at one of their doors. The account of Dr. Hardin's forbidden examination spread through the network of physicians like a fever. It was no longer transmitted through formal, cautious letters. The news traveled in frantic telegrams and whispered, late-night conversations at medical society meetings. The story of the blood-stained ledger, the impossible physical findings, and the doctor's subsequent collapse transformed Jonathan from a shared curiosity into a shared nightmare. The boy was no longer a passive anomaly to be studied. He was an active threat, a force that could unravel not just the mind of a single man, but the very foundations of their rational world. The fear, once a private, creeping dread, now became a collective hysteria, a gothic paranoia that bound the medical profession together in a fraternity of terror. He was a specter haunting their science, a ghost in the hallowed halls of medicine. The sightings, which had once been confined to the quiet towns of the Midwest, began to be reported from across the nation. A doctor in Boston, a man of old family and impeccable reputation, wrote a terrified anonymous letter to a medical journal describing a pale boy who had appeared in his Beacon Hill practice. A physician in the booming, chaotic city of St. Louis reported seeing the same child in a charity ward, his calm presence a stark contrast to the suffering around him. From Philadelphia to the dusty, nascent cities of the West, the reports multiplied. The description was always the same. The pale skin, the calm blue eyes, the simple mended clothes, the name Jonathan. He was an echo, a perfect recurring pattern that now stretched from coast to coast. The phenomenon was spreading, and with it, a dark and insidious folklore began to take root among men of science. They were supposed to be men of logic, but they began to speak of Jonathan in the hushed, fearful tones their ancestors had used for curses and bad omens. Rumors, dark and unsubstantiated, began to circulate like poison. It was whispered that the physicians who refused to see Jonathan, those who turned him away from their clinic doors out of fear, soon met with terrible fates. One story told of a doctor in Chicago, a man who had heard the tales and bolted his door when the pale boy appeared on his step one evening. A week later, the doctor was found in his office, dead from a sudden, inexplicable stroke. His colleagues, when they examined his body, found no cause, no clot, no hemorrhage. He was a perfectly healthy man who had simply stopped. Another rumor, more chilling still, spoke of a physician in Baltimore who, upon seeing Jonathan, had fled his own clinic and was never seen again. He had vanished from his life, leaving behind a wife, children, and a thriving practice. His last known words, reported by his distraught assistant, were that he had seen a boy with eyes that held the end of the world. These stories, impossible to verify, nevertheless took on the weight of truth. They became cautionary tales, whispered in the smoke-filled parlors where doctors gathered after hours. These spaces, once reserved for robust professional debate and collegial camaraderie, now became venues for sharing ghost stories. The men would drink heavily, the amber glow of whiskey in their glasses a small, fleeting warmth against the chill of the tales they told. They spoke Jonathan's name like a forbidden diagnosis, a word that carried with it the contagion of madness and misfortune. The most disturbing of these accounts concerned a respected alienist from New York, a Dr. Alistair Crane, who specialized in the new and controversial field of mental disorders. Dr. Crane was a man who prided himself on his ability to navigate the darkest corridors of the human mind. He believed that all madness had a rational, biological source. He was a staunch materialist who scoffed at the very notion of the supernatural. He had followed the correspondence about Jonathan with a dismissive, professional contempt, viewing it as a case of mass hysteria among his less disciplined rural colleagues. Then, Jonathan appeared at his asylum. Dr. Crane, seeing an opportunity to debunk the myth once and for all, eagerly agreed to an examination. He would not make the same mistakes as Hardin. He would not look for physical anomalies. He would dissect the boy's mind. The examination took place in Dr. Crane's private office, a room soundproof to contain the screams of his patients. According to the notes of his terrified junior associate, the only other person present, the session began as expected. Dr. Crane asked the boy a series of probing questions, attempting to uncover some hidden trauma, some delusion that could explain his behavior. Jonathan remained calm and unresponsive, his answers simple and evasive. Then, Dr. Crane made a fatal error. He asked the boy what he was afraid of. The boy, for the first time, looked directly at the doctor and smiled. It was not a child's smile. It was a small, knowing, and deeply unsettling gesture. He then leaned forward and whispered something to the doctor, a sentence so quiet that the junior associate could not hear it. What he could see, however, was the effect it had on Dr. Crane. The doctor, a man of iron composure, went completely pale. A look of pure, unadulterated terror filled his eyes. He began to tremble violently, his hands clutching the arms of his chair. He started to mumble to himself, his words incoherent, his gaze fixed on a point in the empty air. The boy, his work apparently done, simply stood up and walked out of the room. Dr. Alistair Crane never recovered. He spent the rest of his days as a patient in his own asylum, confined to a padded room, whispering the same phrase over and over again, a phrase that made no sense to anyone who heard it. He spoke of a promise he had made to his brother, a brother who had drowned in a frozen lake when they were children, a secret that Dr. Crane had carried, alone, for 40 years. The story of Dr. Crane sent a shockwave of terror through the entire medical profession. Jonathan was not just a passive observer of their fears, he was an active agent. He could reach into their minds and pull out the one secret, the one hidden guilt that could break them. The profession became irrevocably divided. Was Jonathan a ghost, the restless spirit of a wronged child seeking some kind of vengeance upon the healers who could not save him? Was he a patient, a living boy afflicted with some unknown and impossible condition that allowed him to defy the laws of nature? Or was he something far older and more terrible, a curse that had attached itself to their profession, a non-human entity that fed on the fears of the scientific mind? The debate raged in hushed tones, in sealed letters, in the quiet corners of their minds. The very act of being a physician, of being an observer of human frailty, now felt like a vulnerability. It was as if their clinical gaze, their scientific curiosity, was what drew him to them. The question that had begun as a professional puzzle had now become a terrifying philosophical one. Was Jonathan truly haunting them, a singular external entity moving through their world? Or were they, in some way, conjuring him themselves? Was he a manifestation of their own collective anxieties, the embodiment of their deepest professional fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the unexplainable, the terror of a condition for which they had no diagnosis and no cure? He was their ignorance given a face and a name. He was the question that walked, the doubt that breathed. He was the ultimate symptom of their own limitations, a shared nightmare from which they could not wake. And as this terrifying idea began to take hold, one final physician, a man nearing the end of his life, decided to do what no one else had dared. He would not try to analyze Jonathan. He would not try to fight him. He would simply record him, creating a full and final case file, a definitive account of the boy who haunted every physician. It would be his last act as a man of science, a final desperate attempt to contain the impossible within the ordered lines of a medical report. It would be the only complete record of Jonathan's existence, and it would become his most enduring legacy. Dr. Silas Blackwood was a man at the end of his days. He had practiced medicine for over 50 years in a small, quiet town that the relentless march of progress had largely forgotten. His office was a relic of a bygone era, a place of worn leather chairs and shelves groaning under the weight of old, forgotten medical texts. Dr. Blackwood was a historian as much as a physician, a man who saw the practice of medicine as a long, continuous story. He had followed the chilling correspondence about Jonathan for years, not with the active terror of his younger colleagues, but with a kind of weary, philosophical resignation. He had seen too much of life and death to be easily startled by the impossible. He believed that some things were not meant to be understood, only to be witnessed and recorded. He felt the weight of his own mortality, the slow, inevitable fading of his own story. And in the winter of his life, he decided his final act would be to provide a proper place for Jonathan's story in the annals of medicine. He would not be a combatant like Hardin or a victim like Crane. He would be an archivist. One afternoon in the late autumn of 1899, 13 years after the first sighting, Jonathan appeared. The world had changed. The century was drawing to a close, but the boy had not. He walked into Dr. Blackwood's dusty office, and the old physician felt a profound, chilling sense of recognition, as if he were meeting a character who had stepped out of a book he had been reading his entire life. The boy was, impossibly, both older and completely unchanged. There was a maturity in his gaze, a depth of ancient knowledge that seemed even more pronounced than the early accounts had described. Yet his physical form was the same, the body of a boy no older than 10, forever trapped in a state of perpetual, unnatural youth. He was dressed in the same simple, well-mended clothes. He was still pale, still calm, still alone. Dr. Blackwood, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in his frail chest, was not afraid. He looked at the boy and simply nodded, a gesture of welcome. The boy's request, when it came, was different this time. He did not ask for an examination. He did not ask any probing, personal questions. He made a simple, direct appeal. He looked at the old doctor, his blue eyes holding a strange, quiet urgency, and he said, "Write me down." It was not a request for medical help. It was a plea for preservation. It was the voice of a story demanding to be told, the plea of a memory on the verge of being forgotten, seeking its final, permanent home. Dr. Blackwood understood completely. He took out a fresh sheet of high-quality linen paper, the kind he reserved for death certificates and official correspondence. He uncapped his finest pen, filled it with fresh, black ink, and began to write. He was not just making notes. He was composing the definitive, final case file of the entity known as Jonathan. He wrote with a steady, practiced hand, his script elegant and clear. He began with the name, Jonathan, followed by a question mark. For age, he wrote, unknown, appears as a boy of 9 or 10 years. For physical description, he recorded every detail with the precision of a master portrait artist. The pale complexion, like old marble, the straw-colored hair, the small, faded scar above the left eyebrow. He noted the unnatural stillness of the boy's posture, the way he seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He described the eyes as the color of a winter sky, and noted that they held a depth that suggested an existence far beyond the scope of a single human life. He worked in a profound, unbroken silence, the only sound in the room the gentle scratching of his pen on the paper. The boy, Jonathan, sat opposite him, perfectly still, a silent, patient collaborator in his own final documentation. He was a story dictating itself. As Dr. Blackwood wrote, he felt a strange sense of peace. The fear that had plagued his profession for over a decade seemed a distant, irrelevant thing. In this quiet, dusty office, there was only the act of recording, of giving shape and form to the unexplainable. He was not solving the mystery. He was enshrining it. He filled the page, describing the boy's voice, his polite, detached manner, and the profound, unnerving sense of otherness that surrounded him. He noted the accounts of his colleagues, referencing the impossible temporal and spatial paradoxes, the rusting instruments, the shadows that defied the laws of physics. He wrote of Hardin's collapse and Crane's madness, not as sensational events, but as clinical data, symptoms of exposure to a force beyond their comprehension. He was building a careful, literary cage of ink and paper around a thing that could not be contained. He was giving the ghost a final, official home in the archives of human knowledge. He was nearing the bottom of the page, his pen forming the last few sentences of his concluding thoughts. He had just written the words, "It is my belief that the subject is not a patient in any medical sense, but rather a sentient record, a living embodiment of," and that is where the writing stopped. The pen trailed off into a long, jagged black line, smudging the final word into illegibility. Dr. Blackwood's hand, the same hand that had written with such calm precision just moments before, collapsed across the page. His heart, which had beaten so steadily, had simply and quietly ceased. He had died instantly, his final act the incomplete documentation of the very being who sat before him. Jonathan remained seated for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the old doctor, a look of somber finality on his pale face. Then he stood, and without a sound, walked out of the office, leaving the body of Dr. Blackwood slumped over his desk, his life's work ending on a question that would never be answered. The incomplete case file was found the next day by the doctor's cleaning lady. It was seen as a curiosity, the final, rambling notes of a dying man, but it did not disappear. The document, with its chillingly precise description and its abrupt, dramatic end, was too compelling to be thrown away. It was passed on to a colleague, who passed it on to a university. It was copied, transcribed, and circulated. It became a piece of academic folklore, a strange, unverified addendum to the history of late 19th century medicine. It found its way into medical schools, sometimes read aloud to students as a cautionary tale about the dangers of professional obsession, or as an example of the strange, Gothic anxieties of a bygone era. Through this one, incomplete document, the story of Jonathan was preserved. His name, his description, his mystery was passed down to every new generation of physicians. The boys who had haunted a handful of men in their private lives now haunted the very history of their profession. And so the question remains, suspended in time like the final, smudged word on Dr. Blackwood's report. Did Jonathan ever truly exist as a physical being, a visitor from some unknown place? Or was he something more profound, something born from within the profession itself? Perhaps he was never a ghost that haunted physicians, but rather the ghost of their own limitations. He was the embodiment of their fear of ignorance, the chilling personification of the questions they could never answer. He was the patient who could never be cured because he was not sick. He was the diagnosis that could never be written. He lives on, not in the world of flesh and blood, but in the world of paper and ink, in every dusty medical text filled with the limits of human knowledge. He is still there, in the archives, a silent question waiting for the next physician, the next reader, to open the file and write him down, all over again. The final entry on Jonathan has been written, yet its echoes may still reach you. If this is your first visit, subscribe to join us when the next truth emerges from the dust, and write in the comments what you felt as the story unfolded.